Hello everybody, welcome to Mystery Disappearance and Other Cases. Today's case is a little different in the sense that we're not going to focus on the victim, but instead on the perpetrator, or perpetrators in this case. Today we focus on Brian Lee Draper and Torey Adamcik, today in their 30s serving a life sentence without parole, but at 16 years of age they murdered a mutual classmate by the name of Cassie-Jo Stoddard on September 22, 2006. Although this case is no longer a mystery, but today we're going to dive into the psychology of the case and those involved, similarly to what I did in the Sean Hornbeck case. If you're not familiar with this story, it goes like this. Cassie-Jo Stoddard was born in December 1989 in the town of Pocatello, Idaho. She came from a loving family with an older sister and a younger brother. Cassie was a happy, upbeat, optimist young lady who enjoyed music and art. In high school, she eventually meets and makes friends with Brian Lee Draper and Torey Adamcik, two teenagers who had been friends since their sophomore year. Brian Draper was born in March 1990. He was raised by Carrie and Pamela Draper. At 10 years of age, Brian's mom reveals to him that he was adopted. He has a younger sister as well. From a young age, Brian had a stutter. Obviously, we adults don't care about that, but for a young kid, that is a big deal and grounds to get ridiculed by other students, which Brian was. At around 15, he meets Torey Adamcik, born in June 1990, raised by seemingly loving parents as well, Sean and Shannon Adamcik, and has an older sister named Lacey. Cassie, Brian, and Torey end up working together on a project one day, and they become friends. Cassie saw them as platonic friends, but did Brian and Torey feel the same? Cassie eventually starts dating a young man by the name of Matt Beckham. He knew Brian and Torey from their sophomore year and seemed to be good friends with them. Not necessarily best friends, but they hung out and stuff. Little did Cassie know of the secrets her friends held. Brian seemingly had a fascination with the Columbine Massacre, a deadly school shooting that occurred in 1999. Brian was especially fascinated by Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, the authors of this massacre, who both got killed on the scene. So those are definitely odd role models. Torey is a fan of horror movies, and in particular the movie Scream. Nothing too strange here yet. Many teenagers, including myself at the time, are a fan of horror movies. Brian claimed to have only started to watch horror movies after he met Torey, although a large collection of horror films and posters were found in his room. They considered themselves movie buffs, and Brian even had a video camera that he took around with him. Some of the discussions leading up to Cassie's murder were filmed. The now infamous video can be found online. At first glance, you might be thinking, okay, two high school boys, they seem to be doing schoolwork, they have their whole lives ahead of them, blah blah blah. But when you start listening to what they're saying, it becomes disturbing very quick. They discuss their plan for later that night and say things like Cassie is gonna die, I'm sorry Cassie's family, etc. There were some videos that were taken prior to Friday, September 22nd, the day of the murder. But on the same day, Brian comes across Cassie at 8:29 a.m. and greets her. This is captured on film. Brian and Torey can then be seen in the library around lunchtime discussing their plan around 12:10 to 12:30 p.m. discreetly since teachers and students are nearby. They know that Cassie will be in a big house alone later that night, house sitting for her relatives Frank and Allison Contreras. Torey had bought knives a few weeks prior, waiting for an opportunity such as this one. So, Cassie arrives at the Contreras house not long after school's out. By 6 p.m., her boyfriend Matt Beckham arrives there as well to hang out. Matt had told Torey about the house and was hoping Torey would come to hang out. Sometime between 6:30 and 7 p.m., Torey and Brian arrive at the house. They kind of get a touring of the place, although from what I could gather, it sounds like Brian and Torey were kind of giving themselves a tour. They wanted to familiarize themselves with the layout. In the basement, Brian purposely unlocks the door leading outside for the purpose of sneaking back into the house later. They hang out and then they put on the film Kill Bill Volume 2. Around 8:50 p.m., Torey and/or Brian say that they're kind of bored of the movie. They then leave around 9:30, stating that they will go to the movie theater, although they only drive out of sight but not off the property. By 9:53 p.m., they are in the car. Brian turns on his video camera again. We have the grueling task of murdering our two friends, words expressed by Brian as they listen to Pink Floyd. They seem to relax and collect their thoughts before going on with their plan. They have knives, they have dark clothing, they have painted masks to conceal their identities, similar to Ghostface in the Scream movies. They re-enter the house through the basement, unbeknown to Cassie and Matt. They start making noise in the basement in the hopes of luring them down. They also turn off the lights in the house since the fuse box is down there. The Contreras dog seems to look down in the basement stairs and barks. But again, Cassie and Matt don't go down to the basement. Cassie is a little freaked out. Matt calls his mom and asks her if he can spend the night at the house, not wanting to leave Cassie alone. His mother refuses, but offers to bring Cassie back home with them instead. Cassie declines the offer, thinking she has a duty to the house and the pets. Between 10:30 p.m. and 11 p.m., Matt's mother comes to pick him up. Brian and Torey are aware Matt is leaving. Ironically, from his drive home, Matt actually telephones Torey, possibly to see what he is doing and if he wants to meet up later. Torey whispers on the phone, being in the basement, but Matt believes Torey is sitting in the cinema. After the phone call, Brian turns off the lights in the house again, hoping to draw Cassie into the basement, but again she doesn't go down. The boys finally decide to go up. Then sometime between 11 p.m. and 11:30 p.m., Cassie is brutally murdered, stabbed 30 times in her chest, back, neck, and abdomen. By 11:31 p.m., Brian and Torey return to the car. Brian turns his camera on, and in the now infamous video they talk about how they murdered Cassie, how they're shaking and feel like the event wasn't even real, riding high on adrenaline. This murder would eventually come to be called the Scream Murder. Matt Beckham tried to call Cassie later that night, but no answer. He tried to call her several times the next day as well, but no answer. One thing that I found very disturbing about this case is that Matt actually hung out with Torey the next day. Worried about his girlfriend, Matt even asked Torey if he could call Cassie from his phone. Matt supposedly had a sleepover at Torey's that Saturday night. That's pretty disturbing, knowing what Torey did the night before, and that Matt himself came a hair close to getting murdered himself. Cassie's body was only discovered on Sunday, September 24th, a full 2 days after her murder. The Contreras family returned to the house, and Cassie's body is first discovered by her 13-year-old cousin in a mess of blood that traumatized the Contreras family. Matt and Torey were both interrogated that same day. Obviously, since Matt was Cassie's boyfriend and he was the last one to see her alive, suspicions fell on him first. Matt answered the detective's questions as best he could, visibly in shock over what was going on. He does reveal that Torey and Brian did visit the house on Friday evening, but doesn't believe they had anything to do with the murder. Even when the investigators ask him, could it have been them? Matt responds with no. This leads investigators to question Torey. Torey claims that he went to the cinema with Brian, which then leads them to question Brian. Matt agrees to take a polygraph, which he passes. Meanwhile, investigators press Torey and Brian, and the more they question them, the more suspicious they get and the more they find holes in their story. First of all, they ask the boys about the movie they watched at the cinema. It was the movie Pulse, but neither boys could tell the investigators what the plot of the movie was, or the actors, or even the trailers playing before the film. When this story doesn't hold up, they tell investigators that they went to steal from cars, another story that investigators don't believe. They ask Brian to take a polygraph and he accepts, but right before taking it, he breaks down. He reveals to investigators what happened, though downplaying his role in the murder. On Wednesday, September 27th, Brian leads investigators to the evidence, the mask, the knives, the film they made, which they dumped in Black Rock Canyon and had unsuccessfully tried to burn the evidence. Draper was then in custody, and investigators pull Adamcik for another interrogation. They question him again and try to make him confess, but he sticks to his story. But now investigators have the truth and all the evidence they need, so they were just stringing Torey along, but now both boys were held in custody. At only 16 years of age, Brian Draper and Torey Adamcik were charged as adults. On April 17, 2007, Brian is convicted and sentenced to life in prison for first-degree murder, plus an extra 30 years for conspiracy to commit murder. On June 8, 2007, Torey receives the same sentence. With the restoration of the video that Brian took and then tried to burn, it gave a lot of information and disturbing insight into the minds of the young murderers. It was evident that their disturbing fascination with killing and death wasn't recent and had been simmering in their brains for some time. Even worse, this wasn't their first attempt at killing. They had broken into other homes before, in the hopes of experiencing their first kill. But the other times that they snuck into homes, something always happened. Either the parents arrived home, or the person they wanted to kill left. Other times it was Brian and Torey's own reluctance to take action. When interviewed, both boys always stated that they didn't actually plan to go through with it, that the videos they took were just attempts at making a movie, which was known by their classmates that they wanted to make some form of horror movie, but this was a facade designed to hide their actual deep dark desire. Both boys attempted to minimize their role in the murder and tried to put blame on the other one. But none of this was bought by the courts. Justice came through and both boys got what they deserved, or at least whatever punishment is legally appropriate for a brutal murder like this. Over the years, attempts were made to interview both boys. Torey seems to refuse to be interviewed, while Brian seemed more open about it, and as such, we have more insight from one than we do from the other. I think the most disturbing thing about Brian Draper is just what a nice guy he seems to be. You can see him in a few interviews. He's usually good about granting interviews with people who ask, whether in person or on the phone. He likes to talk and usually expresses himself well. He had a stutter when he was younger, but seems to be over that now. You kinda get the sense that, at the end of the day, all Brian really wanted was human connection. He likes to connect with people, a feeling that maybe he thought he couldn't satisfy when he was a kid. He did seem like a bit of an attention seeker. But, don't get me wrong, I'm not dismissing Brian as a mere understood kid who made a mistake. I think his psychology is a lot more complex and disturbing than that. If we rewind a bit, we can ponder how these boys arrived to this horrific act. What was the motive? It is largely believed that the motive was nothing more than that of the feeling of empowerment and dominance over another person. A thrill kill, plain and simple. Like a kleptomaniac stealing just for the thrill of it, but not because they actually need the loot they took. Or an arsonist who sets fire just because. But where do these bizarre and dangerous psychological needs come from? Obviously the answers vary from person to person, but based on what I've seen out of Brian's interviews, there may be a few possibilities particular to him. Dating back 1 year, 2 years, 3 years before the murder, Brian may have experienced bullying because of his stutter, a speech abnormality that may come from stress or anxiety. This further lowers his self-esteem, feelings of inadequacy. Maybe he doesn't have as big a circle of friends as he would like, but a lot of kids go through this and they don't become killers. It is unclear how long Brian had been a fan of horror movies, but those do enter the picture at some point. Brian and Torey liked the empowerment exuberated by the villains in these films. Brian, at some point, reads up on the Columbine massacre and identifies with Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, two teenagers, outcasts similar to him, who had decided to take their feelings of revenge and empowerment to extreme levels. Brian is fascinated by this and smitten, and probably fantasizes about scenarios where he is in control. Horror movies provide an outlet as well. Him identifying with the killer or whoever is in control conjure up ideas. These ideas and feelings take a hold of him, like a bad flu. This leads to the old age question, should minors watch horror movies or play violent video games? It's a hard question for me to answer. I myself love horror movies. I've been watching them since I was 10 or 12 years old. I personally like horror movies because of their creativity. It takes a certain amount of creativity to create a monster or villain, to show them off with appropriate visuals, to take an audience on a ride. But then the movie ends and I return to my real life. That's just me. There's nothing in horror movies that I want to experience myself. I like to have a good time, get taken through the emotions, then do something else once it's over. Same with video games. I remember parents being up the wall about their kids playing violent video games like Grand Theft Auto and Mortal Kombat. Some violent video games, but it can provide an outlet for reasonable people like myself, or at least I think I'm reasonable. But not everybody is like me. So can we blame horror movies for Brian and Torey killing Cassie? After all, they reenacted a kill in similar fashion to the movie Scream. Obviously, a movie like Scream might have inspired Torey, given him ideas on how and why to execute a murder, but the movie Scream is not what made Torey not right in the head in the first place. If someone's not right in the head, they're not right in the head. They're probably a ticking time bomb that will lash out in some way, sooner or later. Same thing with video games. If you drive over people in a game like Grand Theft Auto, then you decide to actually do that in person. You could say that the game gave you some ideas or inspirations and maybe desensitized you a little bit, but there was already something wrong with your mind before you even played the game. And let's say that Brian and Torey didn't like horror movies or video games. Would they have lashed out in some fashion? My belief is yes, they were taking time bombs. Brian was already cognizant of the Columbine massacre. This event is now a piece of history, so Brian could have simply read an article in the newspaper and still have gotten inspiration to commit a murder or multiple murders. Some people tend to blame the parents. It's the parents' fault that the teenagers turned out like this. And again, I disagree. Were there hints that something like this could happen? Well, it's difficult. I don't think being a fan of horror movies is a hint that somebody would execute a murder. There are a lot of fans of horror movies out there, including myself. So for Torey Adamcik, I don't think his crime was foreseeable, except if someone would have come across Brian's video. As far as his parents saw, Torey was a good, polite kid who just enjoyed horror movies. At school, some people liked Torey, others thought he was a bit odd, but nothing that would scream murderer. I think Brian Draper probably had more hints out there. His fascination with the Columbine shooters was well known at school. I don't know if his parents were aware of this, but many of his classmates definitely knew, and these are terrible role models to have. Is it unusual to be a fan of the Joker or Hannibal Lecter? Classic movie villains who continue to be beloved by fans. But to be obsessed with school shooters who decided to go out with a bang, it was definitely a red flag and would have been worth at least a conversation. If we dig further into Brian's past, we learn that he has been reported at least twice. A student reported that he was planning a school shooting. He would sometimes point at people's heads with his hand and fingers, imitating a gun. Another statement says that Brian was planning on bringing a gun to the next school dance, although I don't know where this story originated from, but obviously there were patterns here. Just one isolated incident wouldn't be that unusual, but they start adding up. One of the things that has drawn me to this case is Brian and Torey's vastly different behaviors in the aftermath of this murder. Brian and Torey, two sides of the same coin, seem to have similar intelligence, were both outcasts to a certain extent, were both fascinated with morbid things, but their reactions to their murder couldn't be any different from one another. Torey seems to have stayed in perpetual self-preservation mode. When we see him in the documentary Lost for Life, he seems to show no remorse for the murder, his victim or their families, and seems to have convinced himself that all of this was Brian's fault, that he was just a follower, and feels like he's paying for someone else's mistake. His delusions seem to be further reinforced by his parents, who seem to believe his innocence and shift blame to Brian. Torey's mom, Shannon Adamcik, even wrote a book called The Guilty Innocent, where she describes her son as a non-willing, completely innocent party. Now, I'll say right now I have not read this book, but from comments I've read online, it seems to be a mother's desperate attempt to save face and proclaim her son's innocence. It attempts to set a narrative of Torey's trial as being unfair, their defense attorneys being inadequate, the situations were unfavorable to Torey, etc., etc. In a sense, you can't blame a mother for supporting her son and do everything she can to help him, but in another sense, is the entire family in denial? When you watch the videos the boys made, there is no doubt that both boys participated equally in this murder. Cassie had more than 30 stab wounds done by more than one knife, and in the aftermath of the murder, we see on the video Brian say, "We just killed Cassie." That felt like it wasn't even real, it went by so fast. We hear Torey respond, "Shut the F up, we gotta get our act straight." Nobody outside the Adamcik family believes Torey is innocent. Not us, and obviously the judge didn't buy it either. Over the years, Torey has tried to bring forth various appeals to have his sentence reduced or changed, some at the state level, some at the federal level, but his efforts came in vain as nothing has changed. To be fair, the Lost for Life documentary came out in 2013, so it's more than a decade old now. So maybe Torey has made some progress in coming to terms with his role in the murder, but my hunch is that he remains in perpetual denial. I do think the Adamcik family has done a few things that some would deem unethical. For example, Shannon Adamcik eventually wrote a letter to Dr. Phil. She wanted to appear on the show with Cassie's family, whether to talk things out or try to minimize Torey's role in the murder, I don't know. But she had this to say about that. "I wanted to reach out to Cassie-Jo Stoddard's family, not in a hurtful way, but in a way that somehow we can all get some kind of understanding for each other and compassion, because I have never been able to express the grief that I feel for their loss either, and I just wanted to know if there was any way they could help us with that." So they want the Stoddard family to help them with their grief? Needless to say, this episode never happened. I think it would have been really uncomfortable and awkward, and I don't think Cassie's family would be interested in going on national television to find some common ground with their daughter's killer's family. I'm sure the Adamcik family has suffered as well. It's not the parents' fault that this happened, but at the same time, you can't really force the victim's family to interact with you or forgive you. I don't know about you, but just looking at Torey gives me the creeps. His almost smug face that he has, and the fact that he has taken no accountability for what he's done. He seems more angry that Brian has given them both away by leading authorities to the evidence that sealed both their fates. To me, he fits the profile of a classic serial killer, and probably would have killed again if he had never been caught. As for Brian, he has a different reaction from his former friend. Brian seems to take some accountability for his actions. He doesn't deny that he and Torey planned and executed the murder, and that they are both equally guilty. He does try to maneuver around questions though in an attempt to make himself look more sympathetic in the situation, tries to deflect or minimize some responsibility whenever he can. I guess it's a normal response. Nobody wants to put this much weight on their shoulders. His behavior in interviews has led people to wonder about how valid his words are though. Is he sorry for brutally killing Cassie and forever scarring her family? Or is he more sorry for himself that he made this terrible mistake as a kid and is now in this predicament, being in prison for the rest of his life? Has he really changed and doesn't desire to kill anymore? Or has he mastered the art of telling us exactly what we want to hear? We can't say for sure. It's like I said, he seems like a nice guy in his interviews, and he doesn't give me the same creepy vibe as Torey does. He can kind of earn our trust, or maybe he's just super clever and has us all fooled. But joking aside, I do believe Brian has some level of guilt. He said in an interview that he sometimes dreams about Cassie. He sees her in school, but in the dream he knows she's not alive anymore. He says he is haunted with what he's done, and I do believe that. Maybe it took him prison and therapy to see the gravity of what he's done. I do think there's still some resistance on his part, but he definitely seems further along in his journey than Torey. It also leaves the question, should they have been charged as adults and not juveniles? I personally would say yes, because if they had been charged as juveniles, it would just have been a slap on the wrist. In many cases, juveniles might get a punishment until they're 18, then their record could be erased when they become adults. Obviously, given their brutal crime, that just wasn't going to fly. But it does bring the controversy of should we impose a life sentence to teenagers, ever? Obviously, teenagers aren't fully developed mentally or psychologically, and they don't have much foresight. They never considered how their actions would affect other people. They committed the ultimate selfish act, a thrill kill, a murder for no reason, and a lot of people are affected. First and foremost, there's their victim Cassie-Jo Stoddard, a girl they were friends with and who seemingly was always nice to them. She's lost her life for basically no reason. They've hurt Cassie's family, obviously, Cassie's extended family, the Contreras, her aunt, her uncle, and 13-year-old cousin who discovered Cassie's body. She became depressed and even suicidal in the aftermath of this discovery. The Contreras didn't want to go into their living room anymore. Their dream home turned into a nightmare, and even when they decided to sell the house, they had difficulty finding a buyer, even going so far as to selling the house for the small balance they had left to pay on it. Brian and Torey have also hurt their own parents. They both have parents who love them, and whether it's deserved or not, some of the stigma sticks to the parents. It doesn't put them in good standing with their own neighbors, friends, co-workers, and other people in their lives. They might get asked awkward questions, get dirty looks, or even get harassed or threatened. Then we have Cassie's boyfriend, Matt Beckham. Matt was the first suspect, as he was the boyfriend and last person to see Cassie. When Matt was interrogated by police, they noted his seemingly surprising lack of a reaction or concern. Now, I don't necessarily agree with this. With everything that's happened, I think Matt was just frozen with shock. I mean, think about it. His girlfriend was murdered, probably less than half an hour after he last saw her. He probably felt guilty that he didn't try harder to convince her to leave the house and go to his place. He probably realized that if he had stayed at the house a bit longer, he probably would have gotten murdered himself. And then there's the reaction at his school. Word got around that he murdered Cassie, so he was subject to harassment and death threats. He even had to take a few days off school until the heat died down. So, you see, it's also over the top. You can't begin to process all this stuff. So, I'm sticking to my story that Matt was frozen with shock. Everybody reacts in different ways. Just because he didn't burst into tears during the interrogation doesn't mean he was indifferent. Teenage boys don't usually like to cry. He helped investigators as best as he could, and he agreed to take a polygraph in which he passed. So, there you go. Matt has forever kept a low profile after this. You can find all of these police interrogations, by the way. They are online. Interrogations of Torey, Brian, and Matt. Channels like Crime Circus and Explore With Us have them. If you're curious about this case, definitely check those out. You can also find the infamous video made by the boys. If Brian Lee Draper and Torey Adamcik wanted notoriety, they definitely got it. What if they had never met? Would this unfortunate event still have occurred? Well, a lot of people have suggested that Brian would have likely become the next school shooter, being so obsessed with Columbine, and I don't think it's a big leap to believe that. I have more trouble to predict what Torey would have done. He was obsessed with Scream. I think it would maybe have taken a bit more time for him to gather the courage to go through with it, but I do think he possibly would have done a murder in similar fashion to the movie he admired. Brian and Torey meeting each other, then egging each other on seemed to have accelerated the ticking of their time bombs, if you get what I mean. Another question to ask, could they have been stopped? Obviously, these death fantasies have been cooking in their brains for a while. People would have needed to pay attention to the red flags, and Brian and Torey would have needed to be forced into therapy. But even in therapy, one cannot change their minds if they don't want to. So it's a tough one. I'm not a psychologist myself, so I don't have the answer. It seemed as though they were destined to cause some tragedy. On the video, as they talk about murdering Cassie, Torey states, "I'm horny just thinking about it." Other than the murder itself, this line is probably the line that disturbs me the most. It means there's a sexual component to their action. It wasn't just for a rush of adrenaline, but for a rush of sexual excitement as well. And that's the most disturbing and dangerous, the classic MO of serial killers. There is a small part of me that feels bad for these guys. They were just kids, and I'm just left to wonder how their brains wandered in this direction, and if it could have been prevented. But unfortunately, they went too far and past the point of no return. They've caused damage that will never be fixed, lives ruined, etc. Luckily, Brian and Torey will be in prison for the rest of their lives, unless something major changes in the laws. As I mentioned before, there are some controversies about sentencing kids to jail for the rest of their lives. I'm sure there are other appeals attempts that will be made. So today's mystery was more the mystery of the mind, of thought processes. I think everybody has a potential for killing under the right cocktail of circumstances. Luckily, most of us will never reach that point. Stay safe, everybody, and keep these stories alive.
She's our friend, but you know what? We all have to make sacrifices. Our first victim is going to be Cassie-Jo Stoddard. She's going to be alone in a big, dark house out in the middle of nowhere. How perfect can you get? I mean, like, holy shit, dude.
I'm horny just thinking about it.
Hell yeah.